Imagine living in California during the 1970s and 1980s, a time when peace of mind was shattered by a predator lurking in the darkness. A shadowy figure moved undetected through suburban neighborhoods, slipping into homes in the dead of night. Women woke to a masked intruder standing over them. Families were torn apart. This was the Golden State Killer, a name that would come to define one of the most chilling crime sprees in American history. But back then, he was known by many names: the East Area Rapist, the Original Night Stalker, the Visalia Ransacker. No one realized at the time that these seemingly separate crime waves were the work of the same man. Who was he? How did he operate with such precision, vanishing without a trace? And how, despite the massive manhunt that followed, did he manage to evade capture for decades? To understand how a single man could unleash such terror and disappear into ordinary life, we need to go back to the beginning. The Golden State Killer's reign of terror wasn't just brutal, it was methodical. His crimes spanned at least a decade, from the mid-1970s through the mid-1980s, with over 13 confirmed murders, more than 50 rapes, and countless burglaries across California. But what made him different from other criminals? It was his precision, his planning, his control. Victims described waking to the sound of a faint rustling. Before they could react, they found themselves trapped, blinded by a flashlight's beam, paralyzed with fear as a masked figure whispered chilling threats. He was always prepared. He knew exactly where the telephone was, where valuables were hidden, and even the names of his victims' loved ones. How did he know so much? Had he been watching them? The thought was terrifying. And then there was his disturbing escalation. He started as a burglar in Visalia, then turned into a rapist terrorizing Sacramento, before becoming a killer across Southern California. With each crime, he grew bolder, more sadistic. Law enforcement agencies across the state were desperate to stop him, but they faced an agonizing problem. They didn't yet realize they were hunting the same man. Despite multiple crime scenes, dozens of witnesses, and a growing sense of dread across California, the Golden State Killer remained a ghost. Law enforcement worked tirelessly, collecting physical evidence, interviewing victims, and comparing notes between different police departments. But something critical was missing: communication. There was no national DNA database, no way to link these attacks together. Each department had pieces of the puzzle, but not the full picture. Traditional forensic methods failed to identify him. His fingerprints never matched any records. He left behind no obvious clues, no discarded weapons, no direct connections to the victims. Even when survivors provided descriptions, he seemed to transform, adapting his tactics, changing his voice, never leaving enough behind to be traced. Years turned into decades. New cases took priority. The public slowly moved on. Would justice ever be served? What no one realized at the time was that his biggest mistake was buried deep within his crimes, something no technology of the 1970s or 1980s could detect: his DNA. The evidence was always there, waiting for the right moment in history to unmask him. By the early 2000s, a quiet revolution was happening in forensic science. DNA technology had advanced. What once took weeks to analyze could now be done in hours. More importantly, forensic experts could now extract more precise genetic markers from crime scene evidence, something impossible in the 1970s and 1980s. And that meant a crucial piece of evidence left behind by the Golden State Killer was now more valuable than ever: his DNA. Investigators had stored semen samples from multiple crime scenes, carefully preserved for decades. When DNA profiling became a standard investigative tool, forensic scientists reanalyzed the samples and confirmed something groundbreaking. All these crimes, murders, rapes, and burglaries, were committed by the same man. But there was one major problem: His DNA didn't match anyone in the National Criminal Database. For years, investigators had hoped that the killer would be arrested for an unrelated crime and his DNA would finally be entered into CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database, but that never happened. This meant one thing: whoever he was, he had never been arrested for a felony. With traditional methods failing, law enforcement was left asking a terrifying question: could this monster really have vanished forever? Or was there another way to unmask him? The answer would come from a completely unexpected place, not a police lab, but an online genealogy website used by everyday people trying to trace their family roots. Have you ever taken a DNA test to learn about your ancestry? Maybe you wanted to know if you had European heritage or whether you were distantly related to royalty. What if that same technology could be used not just to find relatives, but to catch killers? This is where genetic genealogy comes in. It's a process that uses DNA to build family trees, tracing back generations to find common ancestors. Unlike CODIS, which only contains DNA from convicted criminals, genetic genealogy databases are open to the public. Thousands of ordinary people voluntarily upload their DNA results to these platforms, hoping to connect with long-lost relatives. For years, law enforcement had never considered using these databases in criminal investigations. But as DNA technology improved, the possibilities became clear. If they could find a relative of the killer, they could track him down without ever having his own DNA on file. It was a long shot, but with nowhere else to turn, investigators decided to try. Would someone in the Golden State Killer's family unknowingly hold the key to solving the case? There was only one way to find out. Law enforcement turned to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where users upload their DNA profiles to connect with relatives. Unlike private companies like 23andMe or Ancestry.ina, GEDmatch allowed open searches, making it the perfect tool for detectives desperate for a lead. The plan was simple. Upload the Golden State Killer's DNA profile into GEDmatch and see if he had any distant relatives in the database. If even a distant cousin showed up, investigators could use traditional genealogy research to trace the family tree backward, narrowing down potential suspects. But there was one problem. Would anyone in the database be connected to him at all? Since GEDmatch was a voluntary database, only a small fraction of the population had uploaded their DNA. The killer's relatives, if any had even taken a DNA test, might not have chosen to share their data. It was a gamble. The forensic team held their breath as the system processed the results. And then a match appeared. Not the Golden State Killer himself, but a distant relative, someone who had no idea they were connected to one of the most terrifying criminals in history. This was the break they had been waiting for. But how do you go from a distant relative to pinpointing the killer? The answer would lie in meticulous genealogy research, unraveling a family tree that stretched back generations. For decades, investigators had been searching for one man, one identity, one name. But when the GEDmatch results came back, they didn't get the killer's name. Instead, they found something unexpected: a distant relative. It wasn't a direct match, but it was still a massive breakthrough. This person, who had voluntarily uploaded their DNA to the public database, was related to the Golden State Killer, though not closely. The match was several generations removed, meaning they shared a common ancestor somewhere in their family history. But here was the challenge. How do you go from a distant cousin to identifying a serial killer? Think about it, this wasn't like searching for a sibling or a child. The genetic link was weak, separated by decades. This relative had hundreds, if not thousands, of distant family members. So investigators did something never before attempted in a criminal case. They turned DNA into a roadmap, working backward to build an entire family tree, one that would eventually lead them straight to the killer. To untangle this complex web of ancestry, law enforcement brought in a specialist genetic genealogist, Barbara Ray Venter. Her task: take that distant DNA match and trace it backward, generation by generation, to identify a common ancestor, the starting point of the killer's bloodline. This was no easy feat. It required digging through public records, birth certificates, old census data, newspaper archives, marriage licenses, and obituaries. Every name, every connection, every branch of the family tree had to be meticulously reconstructed. Their research stretched back as far as the 1800s, uncovering entire generations of family history. They mapped out dozens of potential bloodlines, all descending from this common ancestor. At the end of their search, the team had narrowed it down to a handful of families still living in California. And within one of those families, there was a name that stood out immediately. A man who had been in California during the time of the murders. A man who had military and law enforcement training. A man who fit the FBI's psychological profile of the killer. Joseph James DeAngelo. Could it really be him? Now that Joseph James DeAngelo was on their radar, investigators needed to ask themselves some critical questions. Was he the right age? Did he live in the areas where the crimes occurred? Did he have the skills and background to pull off these attacks? The answers were chilling. Age: DeAngelo was born in 1945, which meant he would have been in his late 20s and early 30s during the height of the Golden State Killer's crimes, a perfect match to victim descriptions. Location: he had lived in multiple cities across California, including Sacramento and Southern California, where the crimes took place. Training: DeAngelo was a former police officer. He had military experience, knew how to handle weapons, and understood law enforcement procedures, which explained how he managed to evade capture for so long. Behavior: a deeper look into his history revealed that he had been fired from the police force in the late 1970s for shoplifting, a bizarre but telling detail. Could this have been what triggered his escalation from burglary and assault to full-blown murder? Psychological profile: FBI experts had long believed the Golden State Killer was organized, methodical, and deeply sadistic. They also suspected he had a background in law enforcement or the military. DeAngelo checked every single box. The pieces were coming together, but they needed one last confirmation. A definitive, irrefutable piece of evidence that proved Joseph DeAngelo was the man they had been hunting for over 4 decades. And there was only one way to do that: get his DNA. Investigators were almost certain that Joseph James DeAngelo was the Golden State Killer. But suspicion wasn't enough. They needed hard evidence. And in this case, that meant one thing: his DNA. Since DeAngelo had never been arrested for a felony, his genetic profile wasn't in any criminal database. Law enforcement couldn't simply look him up. They had to catch him off guard, obtaining his DNA without his knowledge. So, a surveillance team was dispatched to watch his every move. DeAngelo, now in his early 70s, lived a quiet life in Citrus Heights, a suburb of Sacramento. He was married, had children, and seemed like just another aging retiree. But detectives knew better. They followed him discreetly, waiting for the right opportunity, something small, something he wouldn't even notice. And then they saw it. DeAngelo, out in public, discarded a used tissue in the trash. It was exactly what they needed. Without hesitating, investigators retrieved the tissue and rushed it to the lab for DNA analysis. This was the moment of truth. Would it match the DNA from the crime scenes? The forensic team worked quickly, analyzing the DNA sample from the discarded tissue. This was their last step, the test that could finally confirm the Golden State Killer's identity. The results came back. It was a match. After more than 40 years, the man who had terrorized California under a veil of darkness was finally unmasked. Joseph James D'Angelo was the Golden State Killer. But the most disturbing question remained. How had he managed to evade capture for so long? The answer was unsettling. He had been a police officer trained in forensics and investigation tactics. He knew how evidence was collected and how to avoid leaving fingerprints or identifiable clues. He was meticulous. He studied his victims, learning their routines before he struck. He evolved. When law enforcement methods changed, so did his tactics. And finally, he had simply blended in. No one ever suspected the friendly neighbor, the husband, the father, because monsters weren't supposed to look like regular people. For decades, he had lived among the very people he had terrorized, watching as his crimes faded into legend. But now the legend was over. It was time to bring him to justice. On April 24, 2018, law enforcement descended on D'Angelo's home in Citrus Heights. The arrest was swift, methodical, just like the investigation that had led to this moment. When officers knocked on his door, D'Angelo showed no resistance. He was calm, almost indifferent. This was a man who had spent decades evading capture. Did he realize his time was finally up? As news of the arrest spread, neighbors were in disbelief. The man they knew as Joe, the quiet retiree, the former cop, the guy who rode his motorcycle around the neighborhood, was actually one of the most notorious serial killers in history. One neighbor later recalled, "I used to see him working on his car outside. He seemed completely normal." But there was nothing normal about Joseph James D'Angelo. And now he would have to face the horrors of his past and the families of those whose lives he had destroyed. Joseph James D'Angelo wasn't just a criminal. He was a man with two faces. By day, he was a husband, a father, a neighbor, a former police officer who once swore to protect and serve. To those who knew him, he seemed ordinary, almost forgettable. He had a family, a job, and a home in the suburbs. But by night, he became something else entirely. The Golden State Killer was not just brutal, he was calculated. He studied his victims, learning their routines, watching their homes. He sometimes called them beforehand, whispering threats over the phone. And when he struck, he did so with chilling precision. He would break into homes while families slept. He would tie husbands up and place dishes on their backs, threatening to kill their wives if they moved. He took his time, lingering in the houses for hours, eating food from the fridge, going through personal belongings, taunting his victims. And then, just as quickly as he arrived, he would vanish. For years, investigators wondered, how did he avoid getting caught? How did he seem to know police tactics so well? The answer was terrifying, because he was one of them. D'Angelo served as a police officer in two different departments, Exeter and Auburn, California. He investigated burglaries, patrolled the streets, and learned firsthand how law enforcement operated. When his crimes escalated from break-ins to rape and eventually to murder, he used his training to cover his tracks. He knew how evidence was collected, so he left as little behind as possible. He knew when police were on his trail, so he changed his methods. And when officers patrolled neighborhoods at night, he slipped through the cracks because no one suspected a cop. But why? What drove him to commit such unimaginable brutality? Some criminologists believe D'Angelo had an uncontrollable need for power, a desire to dominate and terrorize. Others point to his past. His fiancée had broken off their engagement in the early 1970s. Soon after, his crimes escalated. Was it revenge? Was it rage? Only D'Angelo knew the real answer. But now, after decades in the shadows, he was finally being forced into the light. After his arrest, Joseph James D'Angelo faced the justice system for the first time. The charges against him were staggering: multiple counts of murder, rape, kidnapping, and burglary. And yet, when he appeared in court, he was a shell of the man investigators had spent decades chasing. Gone was the calculated predator who had tormented his victims. The man before them now was frail, hunched over in a wheelchair, seemingly weak. Was it an act? Survivors and victims' families filled the courtroom, some seeing their tormentor for the first time in decades. They had waited a lifetime for this moment. For years, many had wondered if the Golden State Killer was even still alive. Now, here he was stripped of his power, no longer in control. But the biggest question remained: would he confess, or would he force families to relive their pain in a lengthy trial? His lawyers spoke for him. D'Angelo sat in silence, expressionless, emotionless, until finally, in June 2020, he broke his silence. In a surprise move, Joseph James D'Angelo pleaded guilty to multiple counts of murder, rape, and other violent crimes. For the first time, he admitted to the horrors he inflicted. But why now? Why confess after all these years? The answer was simple: to avoid the death penalty. By pleading guilty, D'Angelo ensured he would spend the rest of his life behind bars without the possibility of parole. It was a strategic move away to escape execution. But his victims and their families didn't care about his motivations. They had their justice. For decades, survivors had lived with unanswered questions, sleepless nights, and unimaginable trauma. Now they finally had a name, a face, and a confession. But as D'Angelo sat there, quietly admitting to his crimes, he never once showed remorse. Even when survivors confronted him in court, detailing the pain and suffering he had caused, he barely reacted. One victim, Jane Carson Sandler, looked him in the eye and said, "I've waited 40 years for you to be caught. You will never hurt anyone again." And she was right. The Golden State Killer, the man who had terrorized California for over a decade, was finally caged. After decades of fear, pain, and unanswered questions, justice was finally served. On August 21st, 2020, Joseph James D'Angelo was sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. There would be no appeals, no second chances, only a lifetime behind bars. Survivors, family members, and law enforcement officials gathered in the courtroom, watching as the man who had once terrorized California sat in a wheelchair, silent and emotionless. Judge Michael Bowman delivered a powerful statement before sentencing him. When a person commits monstrous acts, they need to be locked away where they can never harm another innocent soul. The defendant deserves no mercy. But even with the harshest punishment possible, could it ever truly heal the wounds left behind? Many survivors spoke out, sharing the lifelong trauma they had endured, the fear of being watched, the sleepless nights, the nightmares that never went away. For some, seeing D'Angelo behind bars brought closure. The monster had been caught, stripped of his power. For others, the wounds ran too deep. No sentence could erase what had been taken from them. But one thing was certain: the Golden State Killer would never hurt anyone again. And the way he was caught would change the future of criminal investigations forever. The Golden State Killer case wasn't just about justice, it was about science. For the first time in history, law enforcement had used genetic genealogy to solve a cold case and catch a serial killer. This wasn't a case of fingerprint analysis or a random confession. This was science unlocking secrets buried deep in a family tree. By using GEDmatch, a public DNA database, investigators found a distant relative, built a family tree, and narrowed it down to one man. The results spoke for themselves. Within months of using this technique, police solved a case that had remained cold for over 40 years. The success of the Golden State Killer investigation opened the floodgates. Soon after, detectives across the country began using the same method to solve other cold cases, many of which had been unsolved for decades. But with this new technology came serious ethical questions. Should law enforcement have access to private DNA databases? Should people who upload their DNA for ancestry research unknowingly help catch criminals? Where do we draw the line? Think about this. Millions of people upload their DNA to genealogy websites every year. Most do it for innocent reasons to learn about their ancestry, find lost relatives, or uncover their family's past. But what if that same DNA could be used to implicate them or their relatives in a crime? This is where the debate over privacy versus justice begins. On one hand, genetic genealogy has helped solve some of the most brutal cold cases in history, bringing long overdue justice to victims and their families. On the other hand, critics argue that allowing law enforcement to use these databases sets a dangerous precedent. Would you feel comfortable knowing that your DNA uploaded for something as innocent as a genealogy test could one day be used in a criminal investigation? Many people who voluntarily submitted their DNA never intended for it to be used by law enforcement. After Dingelo's arrest, GEDmatch changed its policies, making it so that users must now opt in for their data to be accessible to law enforcement. But is that enough? Some argue that using DNA in this way is no different than using fingerprints or surveillance footage. It's just another tool to catch criminals. Others fear that one day these databases could be misused, leading to privacy violations or even wrongful arrests. So where do we draw the line? Does justice outweigh personal privacy? And if we have the technology to catch dangerous criminals, shouldn't we use it? The Golden State Killer case didn't just bring down a monster. It changed the future of crime solving forever. The arrest of Joseph James Dingelo wasn't just the end of a nightmare, it was the beginning of a revolution. For decades, thousands of cold cases had remained unsolved, their evidence sitting in storage, waiting for a breakthrough that never came. But now, investigators had a new weapon: genetic genealogy. After the Golden State Killer case, everything changed. Cold cases from the 1970s, 1980s, and even earlier suddenly had new hope. Law enforcement agencies across the country began working with forensic genealogists to crack cases once thought impossible to solve. Within just a few years, dozens of violent criminals were unmasked killers and rapists who had once believed they were untouchable. How many more are out there? Consider this: there are hundreds of thousands of unsolved violent crimes in the United States alone. How many of those criminals are still walking free? How many families are still waiting for justice? And what happens when the technology gets even better? One thing is clear: the Golden State Killer may have been the first, but he won't be the last. This case didn't just close a chapter in history, it opened a door to the future of crime solving. The capture of the Golden State Killer was a moment of both justice and reckoning. For the survivors, it brought relief, but also pain. For the investigators, it proved that no crime is ever truly unsolvable. But for the rest of us, it raised important questions. How did Joseph James Dingelo remain undetected for so long? He wasn't just a serial killer. He was a police officer, a husband, a father, a neighbor. For decades, he blended into society, living an ordinary life while carrying the weight of unimaginable crimes. So we have to ask ourselves, how many more predators are out there hiding in plain sight? And how do we stop them before they strike again? Then comes the biggest debate of all, the balance between technology and privacy. Should law enforcement have unlimited access to DNA databases? Do we risk sacrificing our personal freedoms for the sake of justice? Or is catching criminals worth the potential loss of privacy? As we reflect on this case, let's ask ourselves, how far should we go to catch a killer? And more importantly, how far are we willing to let technology go in the name of justice? Let us know your thoughts below.